Hey guys, welcome to the first part of my new series, Draft to Publish, where I plan to take you guys along on my journey from drafting to publishing. Now, disclaimer, all parts of this series will be me recounting specific stages that have already happened. This is so I can reflect on my experience and give you guys tips and tricks that I learned over the course of writing my manuscript. I also just don't want to document as I go because getting from drafting to publishing is a long, bumpy road. And that's if you're partially lucky, by the way. But besides that disclaimer, by the time this part drops, I'm probably already in the middle of querying. So don't expect consistent uploads for this particular series. Now, before I get into the actual meat of my first draft that I chose to commit to and refine, I want to let you guys know that this was not my first attempt at writing, let alone the one where I actually finished the first draft. Which actually isn't all that unusual because most debuts usually aren't an author's first story. Not to say that there aren't exceptions, of course. As for me, I started writing off fanfics. Now, this wasn't the type of fanfiction where there's like a million words and like 1,000 chapters. It simply started off as me making humorous stories that involved my classmates in primary school before I discovered fanfiction.net and attempted to write anime fanfic. And I say attempt because I never finished them, and I do believe I deleted 2 of them off the site just because they included none of the characters from the actual anime. It was honestly just my OCs chilling in the world, which in hindsight should have been a clue as to what was to come in the near future. Speaking of, I do actually have a video of me doing a reading of my first ever Naruto fanfiction, so if you want to have a laugh, feel free to check it out on my channel. Anyways, I began writing a lot more in high school, and it was during this particular time in my life that I started building my own little universe from what was initially just fantasy personas of me and my friends. The only thing I really enjoyed in English was the creative writing components, but where I really had an interest in writing was screenplay in my media classes. And my first script was actually the first piece of writing set in my fictional universe. And it would be the only piece of writing related to my universe that I created in high school. Fast forward to university. I took about 3 years to finish a draft of what was initially supposed to be a short story set in that universe. It was meant to be an introduction to the world where we followed an amnesiac going on a long journey across the frozen wasteland with a strange woman to go save some girl. What do I do with it? I let it rot because at that time I just wanted to move on. And I didn't have the capacity to do deep edits to a piece of work where the writing style was so different to what mine evolved to. The structure of the story and characters themselves were also very, very weak, so I figured it was better to move on to a different project and then committing another 3 years of editing. So, I move on to my next story, which focuses on vampires. I have the whole story outlined and I have characters sussed out. It's about a monster hunter who was supposed to become a vampire and wants to kill the person who turned her into one. What happens to this project? I get to writing just over half of the story before I drop it. Why? I got busy with a graduate diploma focusing in creative writing. A bulk of my writing time was actually committed to assignments and craft refinement, so by the time I came back to this project, I realized how much my writing had evolved in like a span of a few months. And I knew it was something I had to get back to later if I ever planned to rewrite it. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering why I chose to pursue further study, particularly in creative writing. While I was confident in screenwriting, fiction writing was a whole other thing, and I felt that the only way I personally could get better and understand the craft more was through mentorship and having discussions with professionals and peers. I'm so glad I did though, because not only did it help me get fully invested back into reading, with books I would have never read if it wasn't a required material, it made me understand and appreciate poetry way more than I did in high school. Helped me shift a little bit more from the showing mindset that I had from screenwriting to prose I didn't hate while still being able to make every word in my story count. Obviously, you don't have to study creative writing, but if you're someone who wants to get better, I definitely recommend writing whenever you can and reading or even just consuming media by taking note of the way things are framed, certain words are crafted, or the way dialogue is used. Not only will it help you understand the art of storytelling, but if you're consuming things that are recent or trending, it'll help you sort of know where the publishing market is at, which will be useful during the querying stages. But anyways, I'm getting off track. So besides short stories and writing competitions, I move on to another project. It's a creative writing assignment where I am tasked to write a maximum of 12,000 words of a potential novel. I look at the trove of story ideas I have set in my universe. outline the entire thing, and write the first 5 chapters of the manuscript. What happens to this project? Well, if you thought I dropped this one, you're wrong. This creative writing assignment became the project I decided would be great as my debut. It's called The Stray Scales, and it's a humorous, fractured retelling of The Little Mermaid. It's basically where Shrek meets Howl's Moving Castle and The Princess Bride, with a risk taker similar to the protagonist of Elizabeth Lim's A Forgery of Fate and the humor of Margaret Owen's Little Thieves. I know it's strange to see some of these comps smashed together, but trust me, if this were to ever get published, you will understand why. It's a weird world with stranger characters, and that's why I love it. I was basically vibing with the story idea the moment I began outlining it. The main character in particular is probably one of my favorite characters I've written, and is basically meant to represent a fantastical take of myself and my parents' experiences as immigrants. Obviously, this is not going to be an accurate depiction of a real-life immigrant. For one, the main character is a mermaid, and I'm not. For two, I hate swimming, which is not very mermaid-like. For three, Earth sadly does not have magic, so unfortunately I would not be able to witness a flying broom. Jokes aside though, just toying with the original fairy tale was quite fun. I definitely wanted to include some components from the original story, such as the witch, the sea foam, and a prince. But examples of where I twist the tale was changing the structure of the Little Mermaid's family and giving the prince a cousin, who not only happens to be king, but is also a person that the main character quickly figures out hunts sea folks. So she spends the entire story trying to conceal what she is to avoid being killed by him, while trying to find a way to kiss the prince so she doesn't melt into sea foam. And just so you know, this whole situation only happens because she was a stalker. I will not elaborate on that. Now, obviously you can tell from my rambling just how much I am in love with the story, and that should be you when you write your draft. There is nothing more dreadful than committing to a project that you aren't feeling for and taking 3 years to complete the first draft. Even if you're aiming to become a best-selling author or a millionaire writer, I personally believe you should enjoy the stories you write. And in fact, I loved the story idea so much that when I had already finished my first 5 chapters for my assignment, I decided to participate in a community event hosted in a writing server where the aim was to write 50,000 words within a month. But instead of the 50,000 words, I ended up writing about a chapter a day. So from November to the beginning of December, I completed the first draft of The Stray Scales, and I was so proud of myself because I had never finished any other story this fast. That's not to say it wasn't garbage. I mean, it was the first draft, so it wasn't perfect. But that's kind of the point of a first draft. When you're in this stage, you should be aiming to get your ideas on the page, regardless of how you write it. I know some people like to edit their first draft as they go, which I have nothing against, but for me personally, at least recently, I try to avoid doing that, because regardless of whether you write your first draft without a care in the world, or try to get it as perfect as possible, you will still be refining that piece of turd. I know that sounds a bit intimidating, but that's kind of the reality, especially when you're aiming for traditional publishing, where it's absolutely guaranteed that you will be making a lot of edits. Overall though, completing that first draft was like taking a weight off my shoulder and freeing myself from the chains of commitment. Because once I finished it, I did not look at it for an entire month or so. It was a much needed break because I knew that the moment I began editing it, I would be placing myself in handcuffs again and be putting that damn heavy sack back on my shoulders. Yes, editing is in fact that intense, and luckily for you guys, I will be explaining my experience with it in the next part. So if you guys have any questions, leave them down below. But until next time, see you guys later.